Okay, welcome to section 2 here, part 2. And now we're going to talk about the article itself for this week, The Power of Talk, written by Deborah Tannen, who essentially has been researching the influence of linguistic style on conversations and human relationships. Frankly, gender specific stuff. So, in other words, men versus women, boys versus girls, and kind of what springs out of that. So really, men and women approach discussions and conflict and communication in very unique ways based on socialization. Her basic premise is that we learn these responses through socialization as we grow up as kids. So you're going to probably recognize a lot of this if you're a male or a female in this class yourself, and you'll see some of the stuff as we discuss this. So very interesting stuff, and I've got a couple of videos queued up here as well to support the article. So let's go on. Let's talk about Deborah Tannen and the power of talk. So a couple thoughts here to start off with from the article itself. Judgments about confidence can be inferred only from the way people present themselves. So, and you'll find that women and men, are vastly different in their approach when it comes to how confidence is projected. Give an example. I had a situation previously where I had to hire somebody, or I was a part of a hiring committee for a project or product manager position. And a gentleman who came in was very nervous and shaky and uncertain of himself, and just generally really, really anxious, frankly, when it came to the meetings. So, as much as I thought he may have had some of the right skill sets, generally as the group, we decided against his taking the position, primarily because we had a lot of face-to-face with big clients, and this role would have included him meeting with a lot of customers who would have seen his nervousness, and that would not translate well to confidence with the brand and with our company. So that was the main reason, main thrust. So what happens with women in this situation is oftentimes these things get attributed to them as well unfairly, primarily because their linguistic style is being misinterpreted. It is sort of indicating that there's patterns that we follow largely. So just know that I'm not suggesting, nor is Deborah Tannen suggesting that all men are this way, all women are that way. Okay. The influence of linguistic style on conversations and human relationships, who gets heard, who gets credit, and what gets done is what this article is all about. So we're going to break that down. And by and large, I would say, women and men in today's corporate America, women are at somewhat of a disadvantage because it's primarily been up till recently. You see some changes here, and obviously I'm encouraged by the recent elections where 90 plus women were put into positions of power within Congress. So that's an encouraging development. But by and large, it's still largely male dominated when you think about corporate America. So in this article, she talks about linguistic style and how a person's characteristics and speaking patterns can kind of influence their well-being in corporate America or in a job. So things like directness or indirectness. Okay, now we're going to talk about males tend to be more direct, women less so. Pacing and pausing, word choice, pausing and turn taking. So in other words, sharing the floor, and then of course, do you use jokes, figures of speech, stories, questions, and apologies are all sort of a part of that. Rolls up to what's known as a linguistic style, and it's something we learn from our early days as a kid growing up. So I'd say watch that first one. We talk about that, and she goes into gender and specifics on that. So watch that video. It's about 8 minutes long. And then come back to me if you want. Otherwise, you can watch it afterwards as well. So I mentioned the difference between gender, and that's what that video is about, but I'll break it down a little bit more for you here. So boys and girls in America especially learn and adopt linguistic preferences for rapport building and negotiation of status using play and same-sex peers. So on the left-hand side, you see boys, and they are all about status building, right? So they tend to play in larger groups, and I've got an example from a movie, one of my favorite movies, Stand By Me, where you've got a group of boys who make a trek to, not to spoil the story if you haven't seen it, but to find a kid's dead body. But it's all about status building, right? They tend to play in larger groups in which boys can be included, but not all are equal. On the right-hand side, you've got girls who are more about rapport building, right? So you may recognize this yourself, ladies. They tend to play with a single best friend or a bestie, as my kids say, or in small groups. And they spend a lot of time talking about feelings and moving through things and making sure that everybody's somehow connected. Now, the girl you tell your secrets to becomes your best friend in a lot of cases, and a girl who is too sure of herself might be labeled as bossy. Ladies, does that resonate with you? I know a lot of women I've talked to say that that's true. If you're confident in a situation, you might get labeled by other girls, other women, as being bossy. And that goes all the way up the ladder from when you're a little kid all the way up to adulthood. Boys, obviously, conversely, with high status, are expected to emphasize power via abilities, knowledge, and challenges. And the best example I can think of is who can throw the football the farthest on the playground will often be the leader. And boys kind of automatically acknowledge the pecking order related with that. So could be abilities, could be knowledge, or challenges that they've faced and overcome. And of course, giving orders and telling jokes and stories help to preserve status. And my little clip I've got coming up here in this module shows just that. So that's really one of the fundamental sort of differences that kind of help us evolve the way we've evolved. So stand by me. Here's like this little scene here. And it's just a little clip that, again, more entertainment than anything, but it just showcases, I think, how boys kind of create status and the pecking order of that. So linguistic differences and gender, quickly. I'm not going to read through this whole thing here, but just know the differences between these. So women talk to other women when they have a problem, right? Men often don't see the point in sharing personal issues unless you're a modern male like me, and I probably share too much, so I'm not your typical male. So I kind of rail against what we see here, but generally, men are not forthcoming with their feelings and are not as willing to share. Women are more relationally oriented. In other words, they are more about the relationship. And even if you have a boss who's a woman and you happen to be a woman specifically, she'll oftentimes, set aside her power and cultivate a relationship. Whereas men tend to relate to other men in a one-up, a one-down basis. And we'll talk more about that coming up here. But status and dominance is important, right? So men always want to be in a one-up position, which means they always have the leg up on somebody. And that part of that is just not admitting you've made a mistake ever. So men don't typically admit as much to making a mistake as maybe a woman might do to preserve the relationship. Focus on building rapport. Obviously, we've discussed that, and that's what women do really well, and they share experiences and ask questions and really kind of show interest. Versus men and boys who tell and give information rather than ask questions. They share experiences if needed, but really it's more about just getting the job done and sharing information that helps get the job done. So that's kind of some examples of gender barriers and things that are different between males and females that cultivate this thing we see now in the workplace. So from taking this from playground to the workplace, the author talks about a time when she actually observed this and we'll call them Cheryl and Phil because that's what she calls them in the article, but they were doing a focus group on a flex time policy the organization was considering, right? So the women in the group thought Cheryl contributed the most, and the men, except Phil, of course, thought that Phil contributed the most. So what's really going on there? And actually, even Deborah Tannen, when she admits that she thought that Phil did the best job, but when she reversed that and looked back upon that, she realized differently. So what she came to the conclusion was that women, in this instance at least, evaluated the contributions of a woman more accurately than the men did. So the men were kind of just downplaying Cheryl's contribution, and the women were actually more honest about that. So it's all about credit, right? And men generally, now obviously Phil was not looking for any credit here. He was the one who said, well, Cheryl did more. Who knows what his motivations were behind that. But this idea of status versus rapport are still playing out today like it did in the playground here in the workplace. Let's talk about one-up status. So men don't like to ask questions because you know what it does? It means that they don't know. And that puts them in a one-down status. So why don't you know, Bob or Joe? Now, this is something that we've all probably experienced before. Now, again, I'm not your typical male because I'm not afraid to ask questions if I'm lost. In this case here, invariably, this plays out almost all over the place. We know where we're going. We're not going to stop and ask directions. And invariably, you'll find yourself lost. Maybe in a big city, maybe it's puts you in some risk. So that's really nuts and bolts of that. And you've got a situation where men don't like to admit that they don't know something. And that's really this one-up status, maintaining that one-up status versus one down. Something called ritual opposition. This is interesting. Okay, so many Americans, this is cultural here in the States, many Americans expect a discussion or of ideas to be a ritual fight. So in other words, and I've done this, I work in a creative field, so a lot of times you battle for your creative idea to get to hold sway and to win out. And so oftentimes, especially if that's with other men, you'll battle and you'll say things, and it seems jarring to folks who are not used to that. Now, when I say folks who are not used to that, oftentimes people from overseas will come in and witness that, and we'll feel a little put off by this ritual opposition, right? But it's a way of doing this. Almost, if you can imagine, again, the playground, right? You got kids kind of sparring, jockeying for position almost in a way, and that's just a part of how men behave because they've been socialized so. Here's some benefits. So poking holes and finding weaknesses helps men explore and test their ideas, and that's how it is. So it's not as much a verbal affront or a visual, like a personal attack, as much as it is to really test a theory out. And anybody who's uncomfortable with this linguistic style, including men as well as many women, risks appearing insecure about his or her own ideas, and that happens a lot. I see this in groups as with students. Recently, I saw this where I had a creative sort of brainstorming session in one of my classes. I teach 241, which is electronic media copywriting. Invariably, 4 or 5 people don't even get on the freeway. In other words, they don't even offer any suggestions, even though they may have great suggestions. So that's a part of the problem with ritual opposition. You get people who just are not comfortable sharing in that environment because it's too in your face. The other thing the article talks about too is managing up and down. Now, you see here, I pulled this from the internet, but they all look like they're brothers, so maybe it's not the best picture. But what I wanted to articulate here was just the idea that men tend to socialize with the alpha dogs and the alpha males, and they tend to dress like them too. Women, not as much. So men manage up really well. In fact, they will dress like the alpha male to be like the alpha male in hopes of one day becoming the alpha male. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. Whereas women are more indirect, I would say. Indirectness is a fundamental and pervasive element in human communication, right? Women tend to be indirect about telling others what to do. So they'll give you clues. Like my wife does it, and I don't always pick up on things, but she'll hint at things that I should be doing versus the direct approach. I happen to be a lot more direct than my wife, and I think that generally plays out fairly well amongst the sexes. Men are especially likely to be indirect when it comes to admitting fault or weakness. So that's something, guys, we do quite a bit. Like if it's something we made a mistake on, we're not as prone to do that. And directness or indirectness can be successful provided the linguistic style is understood by the participants. So as long as you go in knowing the different styles, and that's the key. If you're a manager and you've got a team of men and women, just helping, it helps tremendously to know that these are there. And not always are they going to rear their heads, but you'll know at least that women tend to fall in this pattern and men fall in their patterns. So another video I'd like you to watch is recognizing these rituals. So watch that short video. I believe that's also around 8 minutes. Again, it's Deborah Tannen, the author of the article. Lucky to find that on YouTube. So what do? What is the best way to communicate in these situations? The answer is there's no one best way, as results depend on the situation, the culture of the company, and so on and so forth. So it really comes down to that. And one of the key things we talk about in this article is their linguistic styles. So the takeaway for me in this situation here, if you're in a organization with lots of different people, the takeaway here is a critical skill for managers is to become aware of the workings and power of linguistic style, and to make sure that people with something valuable to contribute get heard. So really force people in these situations to contribute, because the only thing that's going to happen is that the company's not going to benefit from their great thinking. So you've got to kind of overcome these linguistic styles as best you can as a manager. Last thing, we'll talk about this more too. I wanted to share this with you because in an upcoming class, we're going to talk about the gender pay gap. Essentially, women don't self-promote as well as men do. Men don't admit that they make mistakes. All of that kind of rolls up to, I think, what we can see here is a gap in pay. Now, we've come a long way, right? And women's rights have really moved pretty far. Like I mentioned, you see all these women now in politics more and more, and bravo. I hope we'll see a female president in this next go-around here. My fingers are crossed. And obviously, with 2 young girls, I hope that this is not the same when they're old enough to start earning a real wage. But nonetheless, you still see, even in '08 and even now, you'll still see this disparity in this gap. So I think this stuff can relate to that. Now, this is some food for thought for you guys if you want to do more research on this. I bet you can find some strong links between the gender pay gap and what's going on here interpersonally within organizations. All right, so that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to focus more on a project called Asking Questions Without Blame. And we also, like I mentioned, we moved the thought piece from this week to next week. So you'll have those two items to do. A lot less lecture next week and more focused on just some projects. So that'll be maybe a welcome surprise for you guys. Let me know if you have any questions. That's my number there. Obviously, you can email me anytime. And I also have office hours. So if you want to see me face to face, which I, frankly, one thing I miss about teaching online is just not getting to know the students personally. But, oh well, we'll do this digitally as best we can. Let me know if you have any questions. Look forward to seeing you guys in week 6.